The keys of Granada did not look heavy. They were small enough to rest on a cloth, small enough to pass from one ruler's hand to another, small enough to vanish inside the palm of a man who had already lost the city those keys were meant to protect. But on January 2nd, 1492, those keys carried more than metal. They carried a city. They carried a dynasty. They carried the final political breath of Al-Andalus. Above Granada, the Alhambra stood in winter light, its red walls rising over the plain while snow darkened the Sierra Nevada behind it. Inside the palace, water still moved through narrow channels. Courtyards still held their geometry. Arabic inscriptions still praised God across plaster and tile, even as the world outside prepared to rename the meaning of the place. Below the hill, the city waited. For Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the surrender could be presented as completion. Granada was the last independent Muslim kingdom in Iberia, ruled by the Nasrid dynasty, descended politically from the long history that had begun when Muslim forces crossed into the peninsula in 711. To the Catholic monarchs, the fall of Granada offered more than a military success. It gave them a final image for a story Christian rulers had been sharpening for centuries: the recovery of a land imagined as lost. That image mattered because victory alone was never enough. A ruler could take a fortress and still fail to control the story of why it mattered. Ferdinand and Isabella understood this. The Granada War, fought from 1482 to 1492, had required taxes, loans, noble service, artillery, siege camps, diplomacy, and religious language. It was not a single charge beneath a holy banner. It was a long campaign of pressure, season after season, until the Nasrid kingdom could no longer turn delay into survival. The monarchy wanted the city, but it also wanted the authority produced by the city's surrender. Granada could prove that Castile and Aragon, though still legally distinct crowns, could act together in a shared, sacred mission. It could strengthen royal control over nobles who had been useful in war, but dangerous in politics. It could show the Church that these monarchs were not merely rulers of territory, but defenders of Christendom. That was the ceremonial meaning. The street understood conquest differently. Imagine, not as a recorded eyewitness scene, but as the kind of ordinary moment a surrender like this would have produced. A Muslim artisan in Granada before dawn, sitting beside a small kiln or workbench, his hands smelling of clay, charcoal, oil, and wet stone. He has heard the terms. Property is to be respected. Religion is to be protected. Local customs are to survive under new rule. These promises matter because the alternative in medieval siege warfare could be sack, enslavement, confiscation, or massacre. Still, a promise written in a treaty does not sound the same when hoofbeats begin outside the door. His family knows the market streets. They know which neighbor lends tools, which official demands payment, which mosque courtyard offers shade in summer. Their life is not an abstract civilization. It is a shelf of bowls, a locked chest, a sleeping child, a debt owed after harvest, a doorway that may or may not remain theirs tomorrow. This is where the grand language of the Reconquista becomes human. Not in the polished memory of kings, but in the uncertainty of people forced to discover what victory means after the banners have passed. Granada had survived for more than 2 centuries because weakness, handled carefully, can become a strategy. Founded in the 13th century by Muhammad I ibn Nasr, the Nasrid emirate endured by paying tribute to Castile, using the mountains as defense, trading through Mediterranean connections. and exploiting the civil wars of its stronger neighbors whenever possible. Its rulers built the Alhambra not simply as a palace, but as a statement. A vulnerable court could still make itself appear refined, chosen and permanent. The trouble was that permanence had to be financed. Tribute bought time, but it also admitted dependence. Diplomacy postponed invasion, but it could not erase the imbalance between a small mountain kingdom and a larger Castilian monarchy learning how to sustain war. The beauty of Granada did not remove the pressure on its granaries, fortresses, taxes, and factions. By the late 15th century, that pressure had become impossible to disguise. Malaga fell in 1487 after a brutal siege. Baza surrendered in 1489, opening the eastern approaches and weakening Granada's ability to outlast the campaign. Near the end, Ferdinand and Isabella established the camp of Santa Fe outside the city, a physical sign that this was no ordinary raid. The besiegers were not arriving to plunder and disappear. They were building a permanent answer to Granada's survival. Inside the Nasrid house, the crisis was sharpened by division. Mohammed XII, known to Christian memory as Boabdil, was not a simple coward standing against an easy path to glory. He was caught between Castilian pressure, rival Nasrid claimants, exhausted resources, and the political damage caused by his earlier captivity and negotiations with the Christian monarchs. Later stories would turn him into a tragic emblem of failure. The reality was less elegant. His choices had narrowed before the final ceremony began. The surrender terms were designed to avoid immediate catastrophe. For Granada's Muslims, they promised continuity under a new sovereign. For Ferdinand and Isabella, they offered a city taken without the destructive cost of a final street-by-street assault. Each side gained something from restraint. Each side also entered the agreement with unequal power. That inequality is the quiet danger inside the scene. A conquered population can be promised protection, but the conqueror decides how long protection remains politically useful. In 1492, the future of Granada's Muslims still appeared negotiable. Over time, the logic of victory would harden. The same monarchy that celebrated sacred completion would soon face a deeper question. If the war had been fought in the name of Christian restoration, what place remained for those who did not fit the restored story? The answer would not arrive in one morning. It would arrive through policy, through pressure, through the slow transformation of difference into suspicion. This is why the fall of Granada cannot be treated as a clean ending. It ended independent Muslim rule in Iberia, but it did not end the conflict over memory, law, religion, and belonging. If anything, the surrender made that conflict more intimate. The enemy was no longer only across a frontier. The people who complicated the victory now lived inside the realm. The real Reconquista had never been as simple as the final image suggested. Christian kings fought other Christian kings. Muslim rulers hired Christian soldiers. Christian rulers extracted tribute from Muslim Taifa kingdoms. Frontier lords raided for profit as much as for faith. Jewish communities served as translators, physicians, financiers, administrators, and taxpayers, valued in one moment and vulnerable in the next. In some cities, coexistence was practical. In others, fear and hierarchy shaped daily life. The frontier was not a clean line. It was a wound that became a road. By the time Granada surrendered, generations of rulers and chroniclers had learned how to organize this messy past into a usable story. Pelayo in the mountains could become a beginning. Toledo in 85 could become recovery. Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 could become divine favor. Córdoba in 1236 and Seville in 1248 could become proof that the direction of history had always been moving south. But memory becomes dangerous when it starts obeying the needs of power. Ferdinand and Isabella inherited more than victories. They inherited a language of sacred conflict that could discipline nobles, mobilize taxes, justify expansion, and mark certain subjects as permanent problems. In the same year Granada fell, the Alhambra decree ordered the expulsion of Jews from Castile and Aragon unless they converted. That was not a footnote to victory. It was part of the harder transformation taking place around it. Conquest was becoming a program of religious unity. The fall of Granada also stood at the edge of another map. In 1492, under the sponsorship of the same monarchs, Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic. The connection should not be made too neatly. Granada did not automatically create overseas empire, but the timing matters. A monarchy fresh from a long frontier war now looked outward with strengthened prestige, sharpened religious confidence, and a growing belief that conquest could be made lawful, sacred, and profitable. Before those ships, though, there was the city. Winter air over stone, water moving inside the Alhambra, families waiting behind doors, a defeated ruler handing over keys that made the transfer of a world look almost orderly. That order was an illusion. Granada's surrender answered one question and opened another. After centuries of war, who had the right to belong to the land when the fighting stopped? To understand why that question became so powerful, we have to leave Granada behind and return to a much older fracture. Before Ferdinand, before Isabella, before Castile became the dominant force, before the Alhambra, before even Al-Andalus. Because this story does not begin with a triumphant army entering a defeated city. It begins with a kingdom already cracking. And before we move into the next chapter, remember this. History does not begin with ruins. It begins with choices that once looked reasonable, fears that once felt practical, and stories that later generations mistake for destiny. If you want more stories like this, where power is examined not as legend, but as a living system, subscribe and follow the next chapter. There, in the council halls of Visigothic Toledo, the first fracture was already waiting. The first fracture was not made by a foreign sword. It was already there in the council halls of Toledo, in the cold spaces between bishops and nobles, in the uneasy silence that followed every royal death. Before Muslim armies crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, before Tariq ibn Ziyad became attached to the mountain that would later bear his name, before Al-Andalus existed, the Iberian Peninsula was ruled by a kingdom that looked older and stronger than it truly was. The Visigothic kingdom had inherited Roman cities, Roman roads, Catholic churches, Latin documents, and the heavy dignity of ruling from Toledo. On parchment, it could appear impressive. Its kings issued laws, its bishops gathered in councils, its aristocrats held land-armed followers and spoke the language of loyalty when loyalty was useful. But beneath the surface, authority was brittle. A kingdom can survive poverty, it can survive bad harvests, rival nobles, and even a weak ruler for a time. What it struggles to survive is the repeated suspicion that the crown itself is negotiable. Visigothic kingship carried that suspicion like a hidden illness. The monarchy was not a stable hereditary system in the later medieval sense. Kings could be chosen, challenged, overthrown, tonsured, blinded, or killed. Noble families did not merely serve the throne. They measured it, watched it, and sometimes decided that another man might wear it more conveniently. The church gave the monarchy sacred language, but sacred language could not remove political hunger. Toledo became the stage where that hunger learned to dress itself as order. The councils of Toledo were not simple religious meetings. Bishops discussed doctrine, discipline, Jewish communities, royal authority, treason, and the moral obligations of subjects. In those gatherings, the Visigothic state tried to bind, alter, and crown tightly enough that rebellion would look not only illegal, but sinful. It was a powerful idea. It was also a sign of fear. When a ruler needs bishops to declare loyalty sacred, it usually means loyalty has become uncertain. The Visigothic court understood the danger of aristocratic rebellion because it had lived with it for generations. Each succession could reopen old wounds. Each faction could claim necessity. Each noble house could weigh the risks of obedience against the rewards of betrayal. By the early 8th century, this instability had become dangerous at exactly the wrong time. After the death of King Witiza, probably in 710, the kingdom entered a disputed succession. Roderick, or Rodrigo, emerged as king, but not with universal acceptance. Some sources suggest rival factions remained connected to Witiza's family. The details are difficult, and later chronicles shaped the story to explain catastrophe after it had already happened. But the broad problem is clear enough. When the Muslim forces arrived in 711, they did not meet a perfectly united realm. They met a political body whose bones were already under strain. The famous legends make this easier than it was. Later writers would speak of betrayal, of Count Julian, of private revenge, of a kingdom delivered to invasion because of dishonor inside a palace. These stories may contain fragments of political memory, but they cannot be treated as clean fact. They are too useful, too dramatic, too eager to turn structural weakness into moral theater. The truth was less theatrical and more severe. The Visigothic kingdom had real institutions, but those institutions depended on elite cooperation. Its army depended on aristocratic mobilization. Its provinces depended on local magnates. Its law depended on enforcement by the very people most capable of resisting it. If enough elites hesitated, defected, calculated, or waited to see who would win, the king's authority could shrink with terrifying speed. A royal title did not automatically produce an army. Somewhere in Toledo, a clerk might have understood this better than the language of ceremony admitted. Imagine him in a dim room near a church complex, copying decrees onto parchment, while candle smoke gathered under the ceiling. The words before him speak of loyalty, anathema, obedience, divine judgment. His knife trims the reed pen. Ink stains his fingers. Outside, men with horses and servants move through the city with the confidence of families who know that kings change, but estates endure. The clerk does not need to know the future to sense the problem. A decree can condemn treason. It cannot make ambitious men stop counting. This is the world Roderick inherited. Not a fallen wasteland, not a helpless kingdom, but a realm whose mechanisms of power required constant negotiation. The church could sanctify the crown. Nobles could provide military strength. Local authorities could collect dues and enforce law. Together, they could create order. Pulled apart, they created openings. And across the water, opportunity was taking shape. North Africa had recently been drawn into the expanding Umayyad world. Arab and Berber forces had fought, converted, negotiated, rebelled, and been incorporated unevenly into the machinery of conquest. The frontier across the strait was not quiet. It was full of commanders, ambitions, rivalries, and men whose fortunes could be made by movement. Iberia was close enough to tempt them. The Strait of Gibraltar was not an oceanic barrier. It was a narrow passage between worlds already connected by trade, rumor, diplomacy, raiding, and exile. In later memory, the crossing of 711 would appear sudden, almost supernatural, as if history had leapt from Africa into Spain in one violent breath. But frontiers rarely work that way. They listen before they break. They collect information. They test weakness. They wait for a door that someone inside has left unguarded. Roderick's problem was not merely that an army crossed into his kingdom. His deeper problem was that he had to face that army while still needing to prove, perhaps even to his own nobles, that he was the rightful center of the realm. A king in such a position fights two battles at once, one against the invader in front of him, and another against doubt behind him. That second battle can be fatal before the first sword is raised. The Visigothic system had tried to solve political fragility by joining royal authority to Catholic unity. It had converted from earlier Arian divisions into a Catholic monarchy. It had built legal codes and councils. It had imagined Toledo as a center of Christian order, yet the very intensity of its language reveals the anxiety beneath it. A society does not repeat the need for unity unless unity has become hard to trust. This matters because the Reconquista would later remember the Visigothic kingdom as a lost Christian inheritance. A world stolen in 711 and gradually recovered over centuries. That memory became one of the most powerful engines of medieval Iberian politics. Kings in the north would claim, reshape, and weaponize the idea that they were heirs of a broken Spain. But the Spain they claimed had not been whole in the way memory required. Before conquest, there was fracture. Before restoration, there was dispute. Before the long war could be imagined as recovery, the old order had to be simplified into something worth recovering. That simplification would come later. For the people living through the crisis, events were probably less grand and more frightening. A king not accepted by all, nobles measuring their chances, bishops trying to turn obedience into sacred duty, towns waiting for instructions from men who might not remain in power long enough to enforce them. Then came the crossing. In 711, forces under Tariq ibn Ziyad landed in southern Iberia. The exact details of the campaign are tangled in later sources, but its consequences are not. Roderic's army was defeated, traditionally near the Guadalete River. The king disappears from reliable history after the battle. Cities began to fall, negotiate, or submit. The political center that had looked so formal in Toledo proved unable to hold the peninsula together. The collapse was not instant everywhere, and it was not identical in every region. Some local elites made terms. Some communities resisted. Some adapted quickly because survival often matters more than ideology when armed men approach the gates. But once the central authority broke, the speed of change became astonishing. The Old Kingdom did not simply lose a battle. It lost the ability to make defeat local. That is the difference between a military disaster and a political collapse. A strong state can lose an army and still organize another. A brittle one loses an army and exposes every private calculation beneath the throne. After 711, Iberia did not become Muslim because every town was conquered in the same way at the same moment. It changed because the structure meant to coordinate resistance failed under pressure. From that failure, two stories would grow. In the south and center, a new Islamic society would emerge. Al-Andalus, complex, urban, diverse, violent, brilliant, and internally divided like all real political worlds. In the north, smaller Christian polities would survive in mountains and borderlands, carrying fragments of Visigothic memory into new conditions. Neither side yet knew they were entering an 800-year story. No soldier landing with Tariq could have imagined Granada in 492. No bishop in Toledo, watching power slip from old hands, could have foreseen that later kings would turn the memory of this collapse into a sacred argument for conquest. No mountain lord in the north could have known that survival would one day be renamed destiny. History did not yet have the shape later chroniclers would give it. It had only pressure, fear, opportunity, and a kingdom whose cracks had become visible too late. The next chapter begins at the water's edge, where ships, horses, rumors, and ambition crossed the narrow strait, and the broken politics of one kingdom became the opening for another world. The water between Africa and Iberia is narrow enough to tempt ambition. On a clear day, the opposite shore does not feel like another world. It looks close, a line of land across the strait, a rumor made visible. A frontier that can be watched, measured, and crossed by men who understand that distance is sometimes less important than weakness. In 711, forces under Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed into southern Iberia. Later memory would turn that crossing into legend. It would give Tariq speeches. It would place fire behind him and the sea before him. It would claim he burned his ships so his men could choose only victory or death. The story is dramatic, and that is exactly why it must be handled with care. Medieval history is full of speeches no one wrote down at the time, and legends that explain success by making it look inevitable. The evidence is thinner than the myths. What matters is not whether every famous detail happened as later writers described it. What matters is that a military opening became a political earthquake, because the kingdom waiting on the other shore was already divided. Tariq was a Berber commander operating within the wider Umayyad expansion across North Africa. His superior, Musa ibn Nusayr, governed Ifriqiya and had spent years dealing with the difficult realities of conquest. Arab command, Berber manpower, conversion, rebellion, tribute, and the constant need to turn raiding power into durable authority. Iberia was not an empty prize. It was close, wealthy, fragmented, and politically vulnerable. That combination is dangerous. A frontier commander does not need a perfect plan when the target is uncertain of itself. He needs information, speed, allies or informants, and the ability to make a local crisis become a wider collapse before the defenders can coordinate. The landing near the Great Rock, later associated with Tariq, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar, was the first move in a campaign whose details are still debated. The exact number of soldiers is uncertain. The chronology of early movements is difficult. Later sources disagree, compress, moralize, and simplify. But the broad line is clear enough. Muslim and Berber forces entered Iberia, confronted the Visigothic king Roderick, and defeated him in a battle traditionally associated with the Guadalete River. Roderick disappears from reliable history after that defeat. For a king, disappearance can be more devastating than death. Death can become martyrdom, A body can be buried, displayed, mourned, used. Disappearance leaves rumor in command. If Roderick died in battle, his faction had no stable center. If he fled, his authority collapsed anyway. Either way, the royal presence that should have held resistance together vanished at the moment the kingdom needed it most. The result was not merely panic. It was the exposure of a political system that had depended on elite cooperation and could no longer guarantee it. Some cities resisted, others negotiated. Local rulers, bishops, landowners, and urban elites faced the practical question that every conquest forces upon those far from the battlefield: whether to fight for a royal order that might already be dead, or bargain with the new power before harsher terms arrived. Imagine a town in southern Iberia after news of Roderick's defeat has traveled faster than certainty. The gates are shut, but not confidently. Inside, a bishop or local notable stands near a table where seals, keys, and tax records lie beside a lamp burning low in stale air. Outside the walls, hooves move in dust. The men in the room do not know whether another Visigothic army is coming. They do know that fields can burn, wells can be seized, and captives can be taken. A decision like this is rarely heroic. It is made with dry mouths, tired horses, and the smell of old parchment. Resistance may preserve honor and destroy the town. Negotiation may preserve lives and mark every signer as a collaborator in someone else's chronicle. There is no clean choice when the state above you has failed to make the choice unnecessary. This is how conquest spreads faster than armies. Not only through swords, but through calculations repeated behind city gates. A commander wins one major encounter. Then local elites begin to measure risk differently. Each negotiated submission saves the conqueror time. Each delay in coordinated resistance makes the next town feel more isolated. Each local arrangement turns invasion into administration. By 712, Musa ibn Nusair himself entered Iberia, reinforcing and expanding the campaign. The movement pushed beyond the first southern landings into major urban centers and strategic corridors: Córdoba, Seville, Mérida, Toledo. The names matter because conquest is never only land on a map. It is roads, river crossings, treasuries, churches, storehouses, workshops, and the symbolic centers that tell people where authority lives. Toledo was especially important. It had been the Visigothic capital, the place where kings and bishops had tried to fuse monarchy and Catholic order. When Toledo passed out of Visigothic control, the conquest gained more than a city. It gained the old kingdom's political heart. A realm can sometimes recover from losing provinces. Losing the center teaches everyone that the old hierarchy may no longer return. The new rulers did not govern every place in the same way. Early Islamic rule in Iberia depended on treaties, garrisons, tax arrangements, existing local structures, and unequal legal status. Christians and Jews did not vanish. Many communities remained, now under Muslim political dominance, paying taxes and adapting to a new hierarchy. Some elites converted over time. Others kept their faith while learning the language of survival under different rulers. This is the part simple stories often miss. Conquest does not replace a society overnight. It bends it. It reorders incentives. It changes who collects revenue, who commands soldiers, whose law has the final word, and which language opens doors at court. In the first years after 711, Iberia became a place where old Visigothic structures, local Christian communities, Jewish communities, Arab commanders, Berber troops and new Islamic authority were forced into uneasy contact. From that contact, Al-Andalus began to form. But formation was not peace. Arab and Berber tensions did not disappear after victory. Distribution of land, status, and reward could become explosive. The men who crossed the strait were not a single harmonious body. Berber soldiers had helped make conquest possible, yet they often faced lower status within the wider Umayyad order. These tensions would matter later, because every conquest carries the politics of the conquerors into the conquered land. The Visigothic world had fractured before the crossing. The new Muslim order brought its own fractures with it. That is one reason the history of Iberia after 711 refuses to behave like a clean civilizational diagram. It was not a simple replacement of one block by another. It was a long renegotiation of power, faith, language, taxation, land, and memory. The conquest opened the door, but the society that emerged behind it was built through years of settlement, conflict, compromise, rebellion, and adaptation. For the Christian communities left under Muslim rule, the change could be both immediate and gradual. The ruler changed quickly. The rhythms of daily life changed unevenly. A farmer still worried about harvest. A craftsman still needed customers. A bishop still guarded books and ritual. A tax collector still arrived, though perhaps now in the service of a different authority, carrying different demands and backed by different force. For those who fled north, the conquest became memory almost as soon as it became experience. Refugees, clerics, nobles, and survivors carried stories into the mountains and borderlands. Some stories were precise, others hardened with fear. Over generations, defeat would be reshaped into inheritance. A lost kingdom, a stolen land, a sacred wound. The men and women who lived through 711 could not know how later centuries would use their disaster. They were trying to survive it. The Muslim conquest succeeded because speed met fracture. It endured because victory was translated into arrangements that could collect revenue, hold cities, and make local elites choose accommodation over hopeless resistance. Yet endurance required more than conquest. It required a center strong enough to contain rival commanders, manage ethnic tensions, and turn a western province into something politically meaningful. For a time, Iberia was tied to the Umayyad world, stretching far beyond the peninsula. Then the Umayyads in the east fell, and from the violence of that distant collapse, a survivor would flee across the Islamic world, cross into North Africa, and eventually arrive in Al-Andalus with a name powerful enough to rebuild authority. Abd al-Rahman. The conquest had broken Visigothic Iberia. Córdoba would show what could be built from the pieces. Córdoba did not need to shout its power. It could whisper it through water. At night, lamps trembled along the Guadalquivir. Courtyards cooled after the heat of the day. The arches of the great mosque stretched into shadow like a forest made of stone, red, white, and repetition. A visitor entering the city in its prime would not have seen a temporary occupation. He would have seen streets, workshops, libraries, gardens, tax officials, judges, soldiers, scholars, merchants, and a court that had learned how to make conquest look permanent. That was Córdoba's genius. The Muslim conquest of 711 had broken the Visigothic political order, but conquest alone cannot govern for generations. An army can seize a city. It cannot by itself make people pay taxes next year, accept judges, repair bridges, enter contracts, serve rulers, or believe that the new order has a future. For that, power needs rhythm. It needs offices, coins, marriages, punishments, ceremonies, and a center people can recognize even when they fear it. Córdoba became that center. The city had existed long before Islam. It had Roman bones, Visigothic memory, river traffic, agricultural wealth, and a strategic position in the south. Under Muslim rule, it became something larger. The political heart of Al-Andalus, the place where a conquered peninsula began to turn into an Islamic society with its own institutions, rivalries, ambitions, and beauty. But the story of Córdoba's rise was not smooth. After 711, Al-Andalus remained tied to the wider Umayyad world. Governors came and went. Arab and Berber tensions continued. Local elites adjusted or resisted. The conquest had opened Iberia, but the question still remained. Who could make this new order stable enough to survive its first generations? The answer arrived as a fugitive. In 750, the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus was overthrown by the Abbasids. Much of the Umayyad family was hunted down. Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah escaped the massacre and moved west through a dangerous landscape of allies, enemies, tribal connections, and imperial memory. By the time he reached Al-Andalus, he possessed almost nothing except a name. That name was enough to matter. In 756, Abd al-Rahman took Córdoba and founded an independent Umayyad emirate. He did not declare himself caliph. He did not need to. His first task was more practical and more difficult: to survive. He had to manage Arab factions, Berber grievances, local converts, Christian communities, rival commanders, and the lingering possibility that the Abbasids might still want him dead. His rule turned exile into architecture. A survivor of one imperial collapse built a new center at the far western edge of Islam. Córdoba became the answer to his vulnerability. Every court ceremony, military appointment, tax decision, and building project helped say the same thing without needing a speech. The Umayyads were not finished. For ordinary people, that message arrived in less poetic forms. Imagine a scribe in Córdoba in the late 8th or 9th century, seated near a courtyard where water softens the heat. His reed pen scratches across parchment. Around him are petitions, tax accounts, legal documents, and correspondence written in Arabic, Latin, or Romance speech filtered through the habits of daily life. He may be Muslim. He may be Christian working within a new hierarchy. He may know enough of more than one world to make himself useful. The smell is ink, dust, sweat, and wet stone. Outside, merchants argue over cloth and oil. Inside, authority becomes lines on a page. A name is entered. A levy is recorded. A dispute is passed upward. This is how conquest becomes administration. Not through one glorious battle, but through thousands of small acts that teach a population where decisions now come from. Córdoba's strength depended on that translation of violence into order. The Umayyad emirs faced rebellions from within Al-Andalus, Christian resistance in the north, and the constant difficulty of ruling a society divided by origin, religion, status, and region. Muslims of Arab descent did not always share interests with Berbers. Converts did not always accept lower status quietly. Christians and Jews lived under Muslim rule as protected but subordinate communities, paying taxes and negotiating space, within a system that could be pragmatic, hierarchical, generous in one reign, harsh in another. This is why the easy word tolerance is not enough. Córdoba could be brilliant without being equal. It could be cosmopolitan without being modern. It could produce scholarship, trade, poetry, craft, and architecture while still resting on legal distinctions that told every community where it stood. Its sophistication was real. So were its boundaries. The greatest transformation came under Abd al-Rahman III. When he came to power in 912, Al-Andalus was troubled by internal rebellion and external threat. The Fatimid Caliphate had risen in North Africa, challenging Umayyad prestige. The Abbasids still claimed the older caliphal authority in the east. Northern Christian polities were no longer invisible mountain survivors. They were becoming more organized and more dangerous. Abd al-Rahman III responded with restoration. He crushed rebellions, disciplined rivals, strengthened the army, managed diplomacy, and rebuilt the confidence of the state. Then, in 929, he took a step that changed the meaning of Córdoba. He declared himself Caliph. That title was not decoration. A caliph was not merely a king with a richer robe. The claim carried religious and universal authority. It placed Córdoba in direct ideological competition with Baghdad and the Fatimids. It announced that Al-Andalus was not a provincial afterthought at the edge of the Islamic world. It was a center. The city rose to meet the claim. Madinat al-Zahra, the palace city built near Córdoba, was designed as a theater of power. Ambassadors could be received inside a landscape of columns, gardens, controlled movement, and deliberate awe. The great mosque expanded it across generations, its architecture turning prayer, dynasty, and urban prestige into one experience. Coins, textiles, carved ivory, and court objects carried the message outward. Córdoba became a place other rulers had to take seriously. Yet grandeur has a cost that marble never shows. To maintain such a center, the caliphate needed taxes, soldiers, loyalty, bureaucratic skill, and constant management of competing groups. The more Córdoba claimed universal authority, the more dangerous weakness became. A small emirate can survive compromise. A caliphate has to look chosen. It has to make disorder appear temporary, rebellion appear illegitimate, and succession appear natural even when it is not. That was the hidden burden of Abd al-Rahman III's success. His reign, and that of his son Al-Hakam II, made Córdoba one of the most impressive cities of medieval Europe and the Islamic West. Scholars, physicians, copyists, jurists, poets, artisans, merchants, and diplomats moved through a world that seemed to prove the durability of Umayyad power. Books mattered, law mattered, court refinement mattered. The city did not simply rule, it attracted. But attraction can hide dependency. Córdoba's stability relied heavily on rulers strong enough to balance court factions, military commands, provincial interests, and legitimacy. Under Al-Hakam II, the system still held. After his death in 976, the succession passed to Hisham II, a young caliph whose weakness opened space for another kind of power. That space would be filled by Al-Mansur, known in Christian sources as Al-Manzur. He did not need to abolish the caliphate to control it. He could rule through it. As chamberlain, general, and political master, he turned the symbolic authority of the Umayyad caliph into cover for his own dominance. His campaigns against the Christian north were fierce and repeated. In 997, he struck Santiago de Compostela, one of the most important Christian sacred centers in the peninsula. To the north, his name became fear. In Córdoba, his success made his authority difficult to challenge. Victory, again, solved one problem by creating another. Al-Mansur's military power protected and glorified Córdoba, but it also revealed how dependent the state had become on extraordinary personal control. The caliphate still possessed ceremony, titles, buildings, and memory. Real authority had shifted into the hands of a man who was not caliph, whose dominance could not easily be inherited without tearing the system he had manipulated. When Al-Mansur died in 1002, the danger did not appear immediately as a simple collapse. It appeared as court conflict, succession pressure, factional ambition, and the gradual realization that Córdoba's magnificence had not removed the old problem of power. It had only covered it in better stone. The city still glittered, but glitter is not the same as trust. That is the tragedy of Córdoba in the Reconquista story. For the Christian kingdoms of the north, Córdoba was not merely an enemy city. It was proof that Muslim Spain could be wealthy, disciplined, terrifying, and culturally superior in ways that later Christian memory would struggle to admit. For Al-Andalus, Córdoba was the dream of permanence, an Islamic Iberia not surviving at the margins, but commanding the center. And yet, the very height of that dream made its later breaking more consequential. When Córdoba eventually fractured, it would not leave behind one strong successor. It would leave Taifa kingdoms, brilliant and vulnerable, rich enough to tempt tribute, divided enough to be pressured, sophisticated enough to decorate their courts while buying peace from their enemies. Before that fracture fully arrives, another memory must be followed north, while Córdoba was turning conquest into civilization. In the mountains of Asturias, a smaller, poorer, less certain story was being preserved. It had none of Córdoba's lamps. It had no palace city like Madinat al-Zahra. It had fog, stone, hunger, and a memory of resistance that later generations would enlarge until it looked like destiny. Córdoba made victory look permanent. The mountains would teach defeat how to survive. The mountains did not look like the beginning of a kingdom. They looked poor, wet, and difficult. In the north of Iberia, where the Cantabrian range rose into mist and stone, power did not announce itself with marble courtyards or river lamps. It moved through narrow paths, steep valleys, wooden churches, damp wool, mule tracks, and villages small enough to disappear beneath weather. Compared with Córdoba, Asturias looked almost irrelevant. That was part of its strength. Great capitals attract armies. Rich valleys tempt tax collectors. Wide roads invite conquest because they also allow control. Mountains are different. They do not defeat power by grandeur. They exhaust it by refusing to become convenient. After 711, the new Muslim authorities controlled much of Iberia with remarkable speed. But control was never the same thing everywhere. The south and center mattered more. Cities, grain, roads, revenue, old administrative centers, and the political heart of the peninsula. The northern mountains were poorer, harder to govern, and less rewarding. For a ruler trying to turn conquest into taxation, not every valley deserved the same effort. In that unevenness, survival found room. The figure later placed at the center of this survival was Pelayo, or Pelagius, remembered as a nobleman, rebel, and first leader of Asturias. Around him gathered one of the most important origin stories in medieval Iberia, the Battle of Covadonga, usually dated somewhere around 718 to 722, though the precise chronology and scale remain debated. The uncertainty matters. Later, Christian chronicles, especially those written in the Kingdom of Asturias and its successors, had every reason to enlarge the event. A small resistance in the mountains could become the seed of recovery. A local skirmish could be remembered as divine favor. Pelayo could be transformed from a regional leader under pressure into the first visible sign that Muslim rule would not swallow all of Iberia. The story may have grown in the telling, but that does not make it meaningless. Political myths are often built from real pressures. Something happened in Asturias. Muslim authority did not fully absorb the region. A local Christian leadership survived. Over time, that survival became a language of legitimacy. Later kings would look back to the mountains and find there not merely refuge, but a beginning they could use. Covadonga was powerful because it was small enough to be remembered in many ways. Imagine a shepherd in the Picos de Europa after rain, moving goats along a slick path above a valley where fog clings to stone. He hears bells from a small church or chapel, thin against the weather. News travels badly here. A fight has happened, people say. Men from the south have been beaten back, or perhaps only delayed. Pelayo's name is spoken with caution because names in unstable times can become dangerous. The shepherd does not see a nation being born. He sees wet wool, hungry animals, smoke from a roof, and armed men passing through a landscape where food is limited and every outsider is a possible threat. If a victory occurred nearby, its meaning would not arrive at once as history. It would arrive as relief. The valley is not taken today. That is enough. For people living at the edge of great events, survival often becomes meaningful long before it becomes ideological. A village that remains outside direct control preserves more than independence. It preserves priests, kinship ties, local habits, property claims, burial places, and memories of who ruled before the world changed. Those fragments can later be assembled into something larger. Asturias did exactly that. The early Asturian rulers could not match Córdoba's wealth or urban sophistication. Their power rested on terrain, kinship, raiding, diplomacy, religious memory, and the ability to claim continuity with the broken Visigothic past. That claim was not neutral. It gave a small northern polity a larger historical costume. It allowed rulers in Oviedo, and later León, to present themselves not merely as local kings, but as heirs to a lost Christian order. Here the Reconquista begins to become dangerous as memory. No one at Covadonga was planning an 800-year war. The men who resisted in the mountains were not drawing a grand map that ended in Granada. They were surviving a transformed peninsula. Yet later generations would need a beginning, and Covadonga gave them one. A cave, a victory, a sign that defeat in 711 had not been total. That narrative helped solve a political problem. A small kingdom needs more than soldiers if it wants obedience. It needs a reason for people to accept hardship. It needs a past larger than its present poverty. By tying itself to Visigothic Christian memory, Asturias could turn marginal survival into inheritance. The message was simple enough for later chroniclers to sharpen. The old kingdom had fallen, but its legitimate flame had not gone out. The reality was less clean. Asturias existed in a world of negotiation as much as resistance. Northern Christian polities fought, married, raided, allied, and competed. Muslim power to the south was not always focused on destroying them. Córdoba had larger problems and richer priorities. At times, pressure from the south was severe. At other times, distance and local politics gave the north breathing room. This uneven pressure shaped the frontier. If Córdoba had thrown everything into crushing the mountain zones early and permanently, the story might have been different. But states rarely allocate force according to later symbolism. They allocate it according to revenue, roads, threats, and immediate political need. The North survived partly because it was stubborn, partly because it was poor, and partly because rulers elsewhere had more urgent matters to manage. From that survival, institutions grew. Asturian and later Leonese rulers sponsored churches, copied texts, claimed relics, and shaped royal memory. The court at Oviedo mattered because it created a political religious center in a landscape that otherwise lacked the monumental weight of Córdoba or Toledo. Buildings, chronicles, and liturgy helped turn geography into authority. What began as hard-to-control mountain resistance became a kingdom with a usable past. A wooden cross, a cave shrine, a damp valley road. These were not grand objects compared with the great mosque of Córdoba. But in the north, they carried a different kind of force. They told people that defeat had limits. They gave later rulers a language for patience. Patience would matter because the Christian North could not simply march south and reclaim Iberia by will. For centuries, the balance of power did not favor them. Córdoba's armies could still strike with terrifying force. Almansa's campaigns in the late 10th century would later remind the northern kingdoms how fragile their gains remained. The idea of recovery existed long before the capacity to achieve it. That gap between story and strength became one of the engines of the Reconquista. The North needed memory because it did not yet have dominance. It needed symbols because it lacked cities like Córdoba. It needed saints, chronicles, genealogies, and old Visigothic echoes because material weakness required moral scale. A mountain kingdom could not compete with a caliphate in wealth, but it could tell itself that endurance was a form of legitimacy. Still, endurance alone does not conquer plains. To move beyond survival, the northern kingdoms would need people willing to settle dangerous land, nobles hungry for reward, towns with privileges, armed religious orders, kings who could extract tribute, and a frontier where war slowly became a way of organizing society. The mountains kept a memory alive. The frontier would teach that memory how to expand. A frontier is not a line, it is a habit. On a map, it looks clean. Christian territory here, Muslim territory there. A border drawn with the confidence of someone who never had to sleep near it. On the ground, the frontier of medieval Iberia was dust, rumor, hoofprints, watchfires, stolen animals, ransom negotiations, empty farms, fortified towns, and roads where a merchant could become a captive before sunset. It did not simply divide two worlds. It taught them how to live from each other. After Asturias preserved its mountain memory, the Christian North did not immediately become strong enough to overwhelm Al-Andalus. For centuries, the balance remained unstable. Córdoba could still send armies north. Local rulers could still raid, bargain, retreat, or submit. A king might speak of sacred recovery, but the men who lived near the border understood a harsher truth. Survival depended on food, horses, stone, water, and the ability to see danger before danger reached the door. That is why the frontier became one of the real engines of the Reconquista. Not only faith, not only kings, not only famous battles. The slow movement south required people willing to occupy dangerous land and rulers willing to pay them in privileges. It required castles to hold roads, towns to anchor settlement, monasteries to organize property, bishops to bless expansion, and nobles who saw the border not as tragedy but as opportunity. War became a system before it became a legend. In the Duero Basin, in the Ebro Valley, Across the shifting zones between Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and the Muslim polities to the south, settlement and violence grew together. Some lands had been depopulated, underused, or destabilized by earlier conflict. Others were inhabited by communities whose loyalties and legal status would change as rulers changed. The Christian kingdoms needed more than victories. They needed bodies on the land, so they offered terms. Fueros, local charters of rights and privileges, became one way to make danger attractive. A frontier town might receive legal protections, tax advantages, rights of pasture, self-government, or reduced obligations in exchange for settlement and defense. These charters were not acts of kindness. They were political tools. A king who lacked enough soldiers could create a town that helped defend itself. Imagine a settler family arriving near a rough Castilian frontier stronghold in the 11th or 12th century. The road has left dust on their clothes. Their cart creaks under tools, bedding, a few cooking pots, perhaps a sack of grain guarded more carefully than silver. Above them, a stone tower watches the plain. The land they have been promised may be real, but so is the risk. A field near the frontier is not simply a field. It is a bet that the next raid will pass somewhere else. The charter may grant freedom. The night still belongs to fear. In such places, politics became physical. A privilege written in ink had to survive hooves in the dark. A royal promise had to be defended by walls, neighbors, bells, dogs, and men who could leave a plow and take up a spear. The people who settled these regions were not merely passive victims of expansion. They were part of its machinery because their hunger for land and status made royal ambition possible. This was not unique to one kingdom. Castile, whose very name evoked castles, grew in a landscape where fortification and local initiative mattered. Leon carried older claims and royal memory. Aragon and Catalonia pushed along different frontiers, especially toward the Ebro and Mediterranean world. Navarre navigated between stronger neighbors. Portugal emerged in the west through its own frontier logic, moving toward the Tagus and beyond. The Christian north was never one simple army marching south. It was a cluster of rival polities, each using war, settlement, marriage, and memory to enlarge itself. They fought Muslims, but they also competed with one another. At times, they cooperated under religious language. At other times, they treated a fellow Christian ruler as the more immediate threat. The frontier did not erase rivalry. It gave rivalry new territory to consume. Muslim polities understood this instability and used it when they could. Al-Andalus was not always a single state after the height of Córdoba. Even before the final collapse of the caliphate, local ambitions mattered. After the caliphate fractured in the 11th century, the Taifa kingdoms became brilliant, wealthy, and vulnerable. Their courts could sponsor poets, scholars, architecture, and refined urban life. But many lacked the military strength to resist northern pressure alone. That weakness produced one of the strangest engines of Christian expansion. Parias. Parias were tribute payments made by Muslim Taifa rulers to Christian kings, often in exchange for peace, protection, or support against rival Muslim states. On paper, they bought time. In practice, they transferred wealth northward. Gold and silver from Muslim courts helped Christian rulers fund armies, reward followers, strengthen courts, and prepare for future campaigns. A Taifa king paying tribute was not simply losing money. He was financing the growth of the danger he hoped to postpone. This is one of the cruel mechanics of the frontier. A weaker ruler pays for peace because war is too expensive today. The stronger neighbor accepts payment because money can make tomorrow's war easier. Both decisions can be rational. Together, they deepen the imbalance. For Christian kings, tribute could be more useful than immediate conquest. A city left under a Muslim ruler might pay regularly, weaken rivals, and serve as a diplomatic piece in a larger game. For Taifa rulers, Christian support could help survive another Taifa. The confessional border blurred under pressure from practical politics. Muslim rulers hired Christian soldiers. Christian rulers allied with Muslim factions. Men who spoke the language of holy war could still count coins without embarrassment. The frontier made hypocrisy routine because survival demanded it. This does not mean religion was fake. It means religion existed alongside land hunger, tax needs, noble ambition, revenge, fear, and opportunity. A knight could believe he served God and still care deeply about pasture rights. A king could invoke the cross and still negotiate tribute from a Muslim ruler whose survival enriched him. A Muslim emir could denounce Christianity and still pay one Christian king to fight another enemy. The border was morally noisy. Over time, military orders added another layer to this world. Orders such as Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara fused religious devotion with armed settlement and landholding. They were not only warriors with crosses on their cloaks. They became landlords, fortress keepers, frontier administrators, and engines of colonization. Their castles did not merely defend land, they organized it. A military order could hold a dangerous zone more consistently than a noble whose loyalty shifted with inheritance, marriage, or quarrel. It could attract donations, recruit fighters, and give violence a sacred institutional form. For kings, this was useful. It placed disciplined armed communities in places where royal control was thin. Yet it also created powerful landholders whose interests could become difficult to manage. The frontier solved problems by creating new ones. A king needed settlers, so he granted privileges that made towns more autonomous. He needed knights, so he rewarded nobles with land that made them stronger. He needed religious legitimacy, so he empowered churches and orders that gained their own wealth. He needed tribute, so he allowed Muslim states to survive long enough to fund Christian growth. Every tool of expansion carried a future negotiation inside it. For ordinary people, these mechanisms were not abstract. A raid could take a son, a bad harvest could make taxes impossible. A town bell could mean fire, not worship. Captives crossed the border in both directions. Ransom became part of frontier life. Markets sold goods that had moved through hands legally and illegally. A shepherd might not care which king claimed a distant city, but he knew which road was safe this month and which valley had been stripped of animals last winter. War entered the calendar. Planting, harvest raiding season, tribute collection, feast days, militia duty, all of it could become part of the same rhythm. Children grew up knowing the nearest tower, the nearest refuge, the nearest rumor of horsemen. A frontier community did not experience the Reconquista as a clean mission. It experienced it as weather, sometimes distant, sometimes lethal, always shaping the way people planned their lives. This is why the long war could last beyond generations. It was not sustained only by hatred or faith. It was sustained because institutions learned to feed on it. Land could be gained. Privileges could be negotiated. Tribute could be collected. Nobles could rise, towns could bargain, orders could expand. Kings could turn danger into legitimacy. Once that happens, peace becomes complicated. Too many people have built their status around the border. Too many charters, estates, castles, and ambitions depend on continued movement. A frontier that begins as a defensive necessity can become a political appetite. By the 11th century, this appetite was growing at the same time Al-Andalus was losing central cohesion. The Caliphate of Córdoba would fracture. Taifa rulers would compete. Christian kings would learn that Muslim wealth could be extracted before Muslim land was conquered. The balance that once favored Córdoba began to shift, not in one dramatic moment, but through payments, fortresses, settlers, treaties, raids, and patient pressure. Then one city changed the meaning of the entire struggle. Toledo, old Visigothic capital, strategic prize on the Tagus, symbolic heart of the lost order later Christian rulers claimed to restore. When Alfonso VI took Toledo in 1085, the frontier stopped being merely a zone of pressure. It became a warning that Al-Andalus itself might be pushed past recovery. Toledo did not fall like an ordinary city. It opened like a memory. Set above the Tagus River, wrapped by water and stone, Toledo had once been the heart of Visigothic power. Its councils had tied bishops to kings. Its churches had given sacred language to monarchy. Its walls had watched the old Christian order argue with itself before the conquest of 711 shattered that world into fragments. For centuries after the Muslim conquest, Toledo lived under Islamic rule. It became part of Al-Andalus, part of a different political landscape, part of a society in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews shared streets without sharing equal power. Arabic authority sat over older stones. Churches survived in some form. Markets adapted. Families learned how to live under rulers whose legitimacy came from another faith, another law, another history. But memory does not leave a city quietly. To the Christian kingdoms of the north, Toledo was never just another strategic prize. It was the old capital, not of Spain in the modern sense, but of a lost Visigothic inheritance that later rulers could claim, reshape, and weaponize. If Córdoba represented the brilliance of Al-Andalus, Toledo represented something more dangerous for Christian imagination. Proof that the old center could be recovered. That made 1085 more than a military date. When Alfonso VI of Leon Castile took Toledo that year, the frontier changed its meaning. The capture did not end Muslim power in Iberia. It did not make Christian victory inevitable. It did not erase centuries of Islamic society. But it proved that a major city deep in the peninsula, loaded with political and symbolic weight, could pass into Christian hands and remain useful. That last part mattered. A city destroyed in conquest is a wound. A city captured intact becomes a tool. Alfonso VI needed Toledo to function. He needed its roads, taxes, workshops, fields, mills, scribes, clerics, merchants, and communities. He needed the city alive because a dead Toledo would have been only a trophy. A living Toledo could become administration, revenue, legitimacy, and a forward base for deeper pressure into Al-Andalus. The conquest came through pressure and negotiation, not through a simple storming of walls. Toledo in the 11th century was tied to the politics of the Taifa kingdoms, those fragmented Muslim states that had emerged after the collapse of the Córdoba Caliphate. In 1031, the Taifa of Toledo had been weakened by internal instability, rivalry, and dependence on stronger neighbors. Its ruler, Yahya al-Qadir, had relied on Alfonso's support in his own struggles. This was the frontier at its most uncomfortable. The Christian king who eventually took Toledo had already been involved in Muslim politics. The Muslim ruler who lost the city had already been entangled with Christian power. The fall of Toledo was not a clean clash between two sealed civilizations. It was the consequence of a fractured world in which survival often required alliances that later memory preferred to forget. By May 1085, Alfonso VI entered the city. The details of the surrender terms must be treated carefully, because later traditions and political needs shaped how coexistence was remembered. But the broad reality is clear. Toledo's Muslim, Christian, and Jewish populations did not vanish. The city became a Christian-ruled urban center, with multiple communities, negotiated privileges, religious tensions, and practical continuities. Alfonso could call himself a conqueror, but he also had to become a manager. That is where victory became complicated. Imagine a Mozarabic priest in Toledo, a Christian whose community had lived under Muslim rule, standing inside a church that smells of lamp oil, old stone, and dust warmed by afternoon light. He hears that Alfonso has entered. Around him, some people may feel vindication, others caution. His liturgy, language, and customs do not fit neatly into the northern Christian world arriving with the king. Liberation, when it comes through politics, rarely asks whether the liberated are exactly what the liberators expected. Across the city, a Muslim metalworker might be asking a more immediate question. Will his workshop remain his? Who will collect the next tax? Will the mosque still be protected? Can contracts survive a change of ruler? His tools have no ideology, but his livelihood now depends on men who do. And somewhere nearby, a Jewish merchant or physician measures the new order with practiced caution. Courts change. Communities adapt. A city can be conquered in 1 year and negotiated for generations afterward. Toledo's streets carried all of this at once. That complexity is one reason the city became so important. Under Christian rule, Toledo would become a place where Arabic learning, Jewish scholarship, Latin clerical culture, and royal ambition intersected. The famous translation activity associated with Toledo would develop especially in later generations, but its roots lay in the city's multilingual and multi-religious fabric. Conquest did not erase knowledge. It changed who could use it, sponsor it, and claim authority over it. Alfonso understood the symbolic value quickly. He styled himself with expansive titles, including forms of the claim to rule over all Hispania. Such language did not describe a modern unified Spain. It described ambition. It suggested that the King of Leon Castile was more than one ruler among many. He was heir, restorer, overlord, the man who had taken back the old capital and could now speak in a larger voice. Titles can be dangerous when they travel faster than power. To the Taifa rulers of Al-Andalus, Toledo's fall was terrifying because it exposed the cost of fragmentation. Paying pariahs had bought time, but time had strengthened the very kingdoms pressing southward. Rivalry among Muslim states had made Christian intervention useful in the short term. Now one of the great cities had been absorbed into the Christian north, and the balance no longer looked like negotiation. It looked like erosion. The response was not resignation. It was escalation. The Taifa rulers turned across the strait to North Africa, to the Almoravids, a powerful Berber-led movement whose ruler Yusuf ibn Tashfin commanded a force capable of confronting Alfonso in the field. This invitation was born from fear. but also from calculation. If the Taifa kings could not stop Christian expansion by themselves, perhaps an outside Islamic power could restore the balance. The decision made sense in the moment. It also carried a hidden cost. A ruler who invites a stronger savior must consider what happens after the savior wins. The Almoravids did not cross into Iberia merely as hired defenders, with no ambitions of their own. They came from a movement with religious authority, military discipline, and a view of the Taifa courts that could be deeply critical. To many Almoravid eyes, the Taifa rulers were too divided, too luxurious, too compromised by tribute payments to Christian kings. Toledo had created panic. Panic opened the door to intervention. In 1086, the answer arrived at Sagrajas, known in Arabic as Zalaka. There, Yusuf ibn Tashfin and the Almoravid forces met Alfonso VI and inflicted a severe defeat. The battle did not recover Toledo. That is crucial. The city remained in Christian hands, but Sagrajas proved that Alfonso's momentum could be checked and that North African power had entered the Iberian equation with force. A new phase of the long war had begun. Toledo therefore sits at the hinge of the Reconquista. Before 1085, Christian expansion was real but still often regional, opportunistic, and dependent on Taifa fragmentation. After Toledo, the stakes became harder to contain. Christian rulers saw that major symbolic cities could be taken and governed. Muslim rulers saw that local rivalry could become existential weakness. North Africa became not a distant background, but an active participant in Iberian politics. The city changed the imagination of both sides. For Christian chroniclers, Toledo could be remembered as restoration. The old Visigothic capital returned to Christian rule. For Muslim elites, it was a warning that the loss of unity could cost more than tribute. For ordinary residents, it was a change in courts, taxes, protections, anxieties, languages of command, and the daily skill of surviving under whichever power controlled the gates. The Tagus kept moving below the walls. That is the coldness of geography. Rivers do not pause because rulers claim destiny. They carry water past banners, treaties, sermons, and fear. In Toledo, the river watched a city become Muslim, then Christian again, without becoming simple at any point in the process. If the Reconquista were only a story of battle, Toledo would be one more conquest on a long list. It was more than that. It showed that the war for Iberia would be fought through cities that had to keep breathing after they changed hands. It showed that memory could be turned into title, title into policy, and policy into pressure on the next frontier. It showed that the fragmented wealth of Al-Andalus could no longer rely on paying for peace forever. Most of all, it forced Muslim Spain to ask a question it had avoided for too long. Could divided courts survive against kingdoms that were learning to make war pay? The answer came from the south. Across the same water Tariq had crossed centuries earlier, not as raiders this time, as rescuers, and soon as masters. The help came across the water, not as the first conquerors had come in 711, searching for an opening in a divided kingdom, but as men invited by rulers who already knew they were in danger. The Taifa kings of Al-Andalus had watched Toledo pass into the hands of Alfonso VI in 1085. They had seen the old Visigothic capital become a Christian royal trophy, a working city, a forward base, and a warning. If Toledo could fall, other cities could follow. So the rulers of the Taifas looked south, beyond the strait, toward a force strong enough to stop Leon Castile in the field, the Almoravids. Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not rule a decorative army. He commanded a movement born from the harsh politics of the Western Sahara and Morocco, a Berber-led power that had built discipline through religion, warfare, and expansion. By the time the Taifa rulers asked for help, the Almoravids had already created a formidable state with Marrakech as one of its centers of gravity. They were not minor auxiliaries waiting politely at the edge of Iberian affairs. They were a state with its own appetite. This is what the Taifa kings either underestimated or accepted because fear left them few better choices. A small ruler under pressure often invites a larger protector in the belief that necessity can be controlled. But necessity is a poor negotiator. Once a stronger army crosses the water, it does not always leave when the crisis ends. In 1086, at Sagrajas Zalaka in Arabic, Yusuf ibn Tashfin met Alfonso VI in battle. The defeat was severe for Alfonso. The Christian momentum after Toledo was checked. The shock mattered across Iberia because it proved that the capture of one great city had not made the northern kingdoms unstoppable. The Almoravids had shown that North African power could still change the military balance of the peninsula. Yet Toledo remained in Christian hands. That fact is important. Sagrajas was a victory, but not a reversal of the deeper shift. It stopped Alfonso from turning Toledo into immediate domination of the south. It did not undo the symbolic wound. It bought time for Al-Andalus, but the question became, time under whose authority? The answer soon became uncomfortable for the Taifa rulers. The Almoravids looked at the Taifa courts and saw weakness dressed as refinement. They saw rulers who had paid tribute to Christians competed against one another and filled their courts with poetry and luxury while the frontier hardened against them. To Almoravid eyes, this was not merely bad politics. It could be framed as moral failure. That judgment gave conquest a language. By the 1090s, the Almoravids moved from intervention to domination. Taifa rulers were displaced or absorbed. Local sovereignty shrank. Cities that had called for rescue found themselves inside a larger trans-strait empire, governed by men whose legitimacy came not from Andalusi court culture, but from reformist authority, military discipline, and the claim that only stricter rule could defend Islam in Iberia. For some people, this may have felt like relief. A divided Al-Andalus had been vulnerable. A stronger state could resist Christian pressure more effectively. Frontier towns might hope that the raids would slow, that tribute humiliation would end, that the North would think twice before pushing deeper. For others, rescue felt like occupation by another name. Imagine an Andalusi merchant in Seville in the early 12th century, opening his account tablets under a shaded arcade while new officials review taxes, weights, obligations, and loyalties. He has traded across cities ruled by Taifa princes who wanted silk, metalwork, books, perfumes, alliances, and praise. He knows how to flatter a local court. He knows which family has influence, which judge can be approached, which tax farmer is greedy but predictable. Now the tone has changed. The men collecting authority speak with the confidence of outsiders who believe they have come to correct decay. Their clothes, accents, legal expectations, and religious severity make the city feel less like a familiar court and more like a province inside a wider project. The merchant still sells cloth, customers still bargain, coins still pass from hand to hand. But the air around power has tightened. This is how political change enters daily life. Not always through massacre or spectacle, but through a different official at the market gate, a different judge in a dispute, a different sermon about what the community has become. The Almoravid order gave Al-Andalus military breathing room, but it narrowed the space for Taifa-style flexibility. Local rulers had once survived through compromise, tribute, poetry, rivalry, and tactical alliances. The Almoravids brought a more centralized and morally charged response to crisis. That gave them strength. It also created friction. Over time, their own authority weakened. The pressure came from several directions. Christian advances continued. Andalusi elites resented outside domination. Internal strain grew within the Almoravid world, and in North Africa, a new reform movement, the Almohads, rose against them. Founded around the teachings of Ibn Tumat and transformed into empire under Abd al-Mumin. In the 12th century, the Almohads were not simply another dynasty. They represented a sharper ideological challenge, a claim to purify and replace the Almoravid order. Once again, North African politics crossed into Iberia. By the mid-12th century, Almohad power spread into Al-Andalus. Seville became a major center of their rule in the peninsula. The Almohads brought energy, ambition, monumental architecture, and a more universal claim to religious authority. They also brought the familiar problem of every reforming empire, the belief that strict truth can solve political fragmentation. Sometimes, for a while, it can. The Almohads restored enough strength to frighten the Christian kingdoms. Their armies pressed north. Their court projected power. Their ideology gave war a sharper edge. In 1195, at Al-Arcos, the Almohad Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur defeated Alfonso VIII of Castile in a battle that stunned the Christian north. Al-Arcos mattered because it interrupted confidence. After decades of frontier pressure, tribute extraction, settlement, and city conquest, Castile was reminded that the war had not become a one-directional march. Alfonso VIII's defeat exposed the danger of overreach and the continuing capacity of a unified Muslim power to punish Christian ambition. Panic and reassessment followed. Castile needed help. The frontier had again become too large for one kingdom's pride. But Al-Arcos also repeated the old pattern in a different form. A great victory could stop an enemy without solving the internal weaknesses of the victor. The Almohad state had to manage a vast space across North Africa and Iberia, with long supply lines, different populations, local interests, religious expectations, and constant military commitments. Winning a battle in Castile did not make the peninsula easy to govern. It raised the stakes for everyone. The Christian response would slowly gather into something more dangerous than revenge. The defeat at Al-Arcos helped prepare the emotional and political ground for a larger coalition. Castile could not present the next confrontation as merely a local campaign. It needed a broader Christian effort. Papal crusading language, royal interests, frontier fear, noble ambition, and military necessity began to converge. Alfonso VIII had been humiliated. Humiliation, when joined to resources, can become organization. For Al-Andalus, this was the hidden cost of relying on rescue from outside. The Almoravids had checked Alfonso VI after Toledo, but they had also absorbed the Taifa kingdoms and reduced local autonomy. The Almohads had renewed Muslim military power, but they tied Iberian defense to the fate of a trans-Maghrebi empire with its own ideological burdens. Each intervention delayed Christian expansion. Each intervention also made Al-Andalus less able to define its own political future. A rescue can preserve land while changing who owns the decision. By the opening years of the 13th century, the peninsula had entered a dangerous balance. Christian kingdoms were still divided, but they had learned to use crusading legitimacy, frontier institutions, and settlement systems. Almohad authority was still formidable, but its strength depended on holding together a large and strained imperial project. The next major clash would not be another isolated battle remembered only by specialists. It would take place near the passes of the Sierra Morena, Las Navas de Tolosa. In 1212, the long argument between frontier pressure and imperial rescue would reach one of its most decisive moments. The battlefield would not end Muslim Spain overnight. History rarely grants such clean endings, but it would break the last great shield protecting Al-Andalus. And after that, the road to the great cities of the south would begin to open. The road to Las Navas de Tolosas ran through heat, dust, and humiliation. Not only the humiliation of one king, though Alfonso VIII of Castile had carried that wound since Alhambra in 1195. The defeat there had been more than a battlefield loss. It had exposed Castile's vulnerability, reminded the Christian North that Almohad power was still dangerous, and turned royal pride into a political problem that could not be solved by anger alone. By 1212, the answer had become larger than Castile. Armies moved toward the Sierra Morena, where mountain passes guarded the route into Almohad-held territory. The coalition was not as simple as later memory would prefer. Christian Iberia was still divided by rival crowns, local ambitions, noble calculations, and old grievances. Yet for a moment, those divisions were disciplined by fear, opportunity, and crusading language. Alfonso VIII of Castile needed redemption. Peter II of Aragon brought royal force from the east. Sancho VII of Navarre would become attached to one of the battle's most enduring legends. Bishops, nobles, military orders, town militias, foreign crusaders, and frontier fighters joined a campaign that could be described as holy without ceasing to be political. That mixture gave the march its power. The papacy had encouraged crusading war in Iberia, framing the struggle against the Almohads as part of a wider Christian duty. This mattered because spiritual language could solve practical problems. It helped gather men who might not otherwise serve under one king's ambition. It offered indulgence, prestige, and moral clarity to a campaign that still required food, pack animals, money, roads, scouts, and discipline. A holy army still needs water. Imagine a foot soldier in July 1212, walking through the dry approaches near the Sierra Morena with dust stuck to his sweat and wool. He does not see a grand civilizational turning point. He sees the back of the man in front of him, a leather water skin growing lighter, a mule stumbling under baggage, the glint of metal too hot to touch comfortably. Somewhere ahead, commanders discuss routes and passes. Behind him, priests speak of salvation and duty. His body receives the argument in simpler terms: thirst, fear, weight, obedience. This is where crusading rhetoric meets the ground. A campaign can be blessed from above, but it is carried forward by feet, animals, carts, and men who may never fully understand the political meaning of the place where they are told to stand. The Almohad Caliph, Muhammad al-Nasir, waited with a force meant to defend imperial authority in Iberia. The Almohads had already shown their strength at Alhambra. Their presence represented more than one army. It represented the last great North African imperial shield over Al-Andalus, the structure that had replaced Taifa weakness with a larger, harsher, more centralized defense. That shield had to hold. If the Almohads defeated the Christian coalition, Castile's recovery after Alarcos could collapse into another generation of caution. Aragon and Navarre would reconsider the cost of cooperation. Frontier confidence would retreat. The Taifa past would not return, but Muslim political strength in Iberia would remain protected by a power large enough to punish northern expansion. If the Almohads lost, the result would not be immediate conquest of all the south, but the psychological and strategic balance would change. On July 16, 1212, near Las Navas de Tolosa, the armies met. Medieval battle narratives are often crowded with uncertain numbers, heroic embellishments, and later claims. The famous stories surrounding Sancho VII and chains around the Almohad Guard belong to a tradition that needs caution. What can be said with confidence is that the Christian coalition won a major victory, and that Almohad prestige suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered in Iberia. The battle mattered because it joined symbolism to consequence. For Castile, Las Navas answered Alarcos. Alfonso VIII could now turn humiliation into vindication. For the wider Christian north, the victory proved that cooperation across rival kingdoms could produce results too large for one ruler alone. For the papacy and clerical writers, it could be shaped into evidence that crusading effort in Iberia enjoyed divine favor. For Al-Andalus, the defeat was more severe than the loss of men on the field. A great imperial protector had failed in open battle. That failure did not empty cities overnight, but it weakened the confidence that had made Almohad intervention politically useful. If North African power could not reliably secure the frontier, then local Muslim communities and rulers had to face a harsher future: negotiation, fragmentation, tribute, or isolation. The dust settled on more than bodies. It settled on assumptions. Still, Las Navas should not be mistaken for a magical door swinging open the next morning. History is rarely so obedient to a single date. The Christian kingdoms still had rivalries. Campaigns still required money. Fortresses still had to be taken one by one. Cities still had walls, granaries, defenders, and bargaining power. The Almohads remained present for a time, and Muslim rule in Iberia would continue for nearly 3 more centuries in Granada. The importance of 1212 lies in direction. After Las Navas, the old pattern of Almohad recovery became harder to sustain. The empire faced internal strains across North Africa and Iberia. Local authority weakened. Christian rulers gained confidence and room for movement. Next century would see a dramatic acceleration. Córdoba in 1236, Valencia in 1238, Seville in 1248. Those conquests were not automatic results of Las Navas, but the battle helped make their world possible. Victory also carried a bill. The land south of the old frontier was not empty. Taking it meant governing people who did not vanish because a battlefield had been won. Muslim farmers, artisans, merchants, jurists, and families lived in the cities and countryside that Christian rulers now imagined more openly as future possession. Each campaign raised practical questions. Who would receive land? Who would work it? Which mosques would become churches? Which communities could remain? What taxes would replace older ones? And how much autonomy frontier towns and military orders would demand in exchange for service? War had opened the road. Administration would decide what kind of society followed. For the men who survived Las Navas, the immediate memory may have been less grand than later chronicles made it. Heat, wounds, thirst, the smell of iron, torn banners, bodies stripped or buried, horses wandering without riders. The language of crusade could lift the victory into heaven, but the battlefield remained stubbornly earthly. That earthly cost did not weaken the legend. It fed it. Las Navas became one of the great proof points in the Christian memory of the Reconquista. The day rival kings stood together, the day the Almohad shield cracked, the day the road south seemed to widen. Later generations would polish the event until it looked almost inevitable. But in 1212, nothing was inevitable except the need to exploit the victory before the moment passed. The Christian kingdoms had won the field. Now they faced the harder test, turning momentum into possession. That required sieges, settlers, charters, bishops, property records, military orders, and kings willing to spend victories slowly. The next great phase of the Reconquista would not be decided only in open battle. It would be decided at city gates in surrender terms, in ledgers of redistributed land, in mosques converted or protected, and in the uneasy lives of people who remained after the banners changed. Las Navas broke the last great shield, but a broken shield is not the same as a conquered country. Beyond the mountain passes waited the great cities of the south, Córdoba, Valencia, each one rich with memory, each one difficult to take, and each one about to test whether conquest could become rule. A city does not fall only when its gates open. It falls again when its records are rewritten. After Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, the south of Iberia did not collapse in a single movement. No army marched from the battlefield and immediately erased Al-Andalus. Fortresses still held, cities still negotiated, rulers still calculated, families still opened shops in the morning, repaired tools, baked bread, paid taxes, and waited for news from roads that had become more dangerous than usual. But the direction of pressure had changed. The Almohad shield had cracked. Christian rulers now saw opportunities that earlier generations could only imagine. The conquest of the great cities in the 13th century was not a simple continuation of battlefield momentum. It was the moment when victory had to become administration, when sacred language had to face property disputes, empty houses, damaged walls, hungry soldiers, and urban populations that did not disappear because a king had entered triumphantly. The first great symbol was Córdoba. In 1236, Ferdinand III of Castile took the city that had once been the heart of the Umayyad Caliphate in the west. Córdoba was no longer the dazzling capital it had been under Abd al-Rahman III or Al-Hakam II. The Caliphate had fractured more than 2 centuries earlier. Political gravity had shifted, yet names carry weight long after armies weaken. Córdoba still meant something. For Christian memory, its capture could be read as reversal. The city of the great mosque, the old emblem of Muslim power, now under a Castilian king later remembered as saintly. For Muslim communities, it was another contraction of a world that had once seemed capable of commanding the peninsula. For Ferdinand, it was both a sacred victory and a practical burden. He did not inherit an empty monument. He inherited neighborhoods, irrigation systems, workshops, fields, mills, walls, tax obligations, and people whose knowledge made the city usable. The great mosque was converted into a cathedral, a symbolic act that turned architecture into a declaration of sovereignty. But symbolism could not grind grain, repair roofs, or restore revenue by itself. A conquered city had to keep functioning, or victory became an expensive ruin. That was the central problem of the 13th century conquests. Christian rulers wanted land, prestige, and religious transformation. They also needed labor, craft, agriculture, and urban continuity. The people most capable of keeping conquered places alive were often the same people whose presence complicated the victorious story. This tension appeared again in Valencia. In 1238, James I of Aragon captured Valencia after a long campaign that expanded Aragonese power along the eastern coast. His conquest belonged to a different political geography than Castile's push down the Guadalquivir. Aragon looked toward the Mediterranean as much as toward the interior. Ports, commerce, urban law, and coastal strategy mattered deeply. Valencia's fall brought glory to James, but it also forced settlement decisions that would shape the region for generations. Muslim inhabitants did not simply vanish. Many remained as mudéjars under Christian rule, working fields, paying rents, and living within a legal hierarchy that protected them in some ways while marking them as subordinate. Christian settlers arrived, lands were granted. A new ruling class took shape over an older population. The conquest created a layered society. Not peace, not equality, layering. Old irrigation networks still needed hands. Orchards did not become Christian because a banner changed. Rural communities could be exploited, taxed, displaced, or tolerated, depending on what rulers and landlords needed most. A king might speak in the language of crusade, but the countryside forced him to think in terms of harvests. That is where ideology met water channels. Seville came next as the great prize of the southwest. In 1248, Ferdinand III captured Seville after a major campaign that depended on siege pressure, river strategy, and the control of the Guadalquivir. Seville was not merely another city. It was a gateway, a commercial center, a former Almohad capital in Iberia, and a key to the lower river valley. Taking it gave Castile access to a zone of immense future importance. But Seville also revealed the human cost of conquest more sharply. Imagine a Muslim potter in Seville after the city has passed into Christian hands. His kiln still holds heat from the previous day. Ash clings to the floor, clay dries under cloth. Outside, unfamiliar soldiers move through streets where Arabic signs, market habits, and neighborhood loyalties have not yet adjusted to the new order. He knows the demand for bowls, tiles, jars, and lamps will not disappear. People still need vessels for oil, water, grain, and cooking. Yet everything around the work has changed. The person who collects dues may change. The landlord may change. A mosque may become a church. A neighbor may leave. A property once secure under one legal order may be questioned under another. His craft survives because bodies still need objects, but survival is not the same as safety. For many urban Muslims, conquest meant negotiation under shrinking power. Some communities remained for a time. Others left, were expelled, or were gradually pushed into less secure positions. Jewish communities could serve important administrative, financial, and intellectual roles under Christian rulers, but their usefulness did not protect them permanently from resentment or violence. Christians arriving from the north saw opportunity: houses, land, offices, shops, status. A city after conquest is crowded with expectations. The winners expect reward. The defeated expect terms to be honored. The king expects revenue. The church expects restoration. Nobles expect estates. Settlers expect land. Military orders expect endowments. The problem is that all of these expectations cannot be satisfied without taking something from someone. That is why records mattered. The repartimientos, distributions of conquered property, were not just administrative paperwork. They were the mechanism by which victory entered daily life. Land, houses, shops, mills, orchards, and rights could be assigned to nobles, soldiers, churches, monasteries, orders, and settlers. A royal grant could turn a battlefield service into a permanent claim. A line in a register could decide whose family would rise, whose family would leave, and whose labor would now enrich a different master. The sword opened the gate. The ledger decided the future. Ferdinand III and James of Us did not face identical circumstances, but they shared the same basic burden. Conquest had to be stabilized. Too much expulsion could damage production. Too much tolerance could anger those who believed victory should transform the religious landscape more completely. Too much power for nobles and orders could weaken royal authority. Too little reward could make future campaigns harder to mobilize. So rulers balanced. They preserved when preservation paid. They replaced when replacement strengthened control. They honored terms when honoring terms was useful. They broke or narrowed them when pressure, ideology, or opportunity changed the calculation. This did not happen in every place at the same speed, but the pattern mattered. Coexistence under Christian rule became increasingly conditional. The great cities taught the conquerors that ruling was slower than winning. Córdoba gave Castile a sacred trophy. Valencia gave Aragon a Mediterranean prize and a difficult rural inheritance. Seville gave Ferdinand a vast urban and riverine base, but also a redistribution problem on a scale that could not be solved by ceremony. Each conquest moved the frontier southward. Each also pulled Christian rulers deeper into the management of mixed populations, property transfer, labor needs, and religious hierarchy. For Al-Andalus, the loss of these cities was devastating because it compressed what remained. After Córdoba, Valencia, and Seville, Muslim political power in Iberia no longer looked like a wide civilization with multiple great centers. It became narrower, more defensive, more dependent on the survival of the Nasrid Emirate of Granada. The map had not become entirely Christian, but the scale of Muslim sovereignty had changed. A world that once contained Córdoba as a caliphal center now had to look toward Granada as refuge, symbol, and bargaining position. That compression shaped the next 2 centuries. Granada would survive not because the Christian kingdoms forgot it, and not because it was stronger than the states around it. It survived because the politics of Iberia remained complicated. Castilian civil conflicts, tribute payments, mountain defenses, diplomacy, trade, and the usefulness of leaving a small Muslim kingdom alive under pressure. The fall of the great cities, therefore, did not finish the Reconquista. It changed its form. The war of open expansion became, for long stretches, a war of pressure, payment, raids, hostage-taking, dynastic bargaining, and controlled survival. The Christian kingdoms had taken the largest prizes, but the last Muslim state endured in the mountains and valleys around Granada, beautiful enough to impress its enemies and vulnerable enough to pay them. In Córdoba, the mosque became a cathedral. In Valencia, fields kept drinking through old channels. In Seville, the Guadalquivir carried the prophets and silences of a new order. And in Granada, water still ran through palace gardens, while silver left the kingdom to buy one more season of peace. Granada survived by making weakness useful. That is not the kind of sentence rulers put on walls. The Alhambra preferred better language, poetry carved into plaster, praise to God, the elegance of water guided through stone, the geometry of a court that wanted every visitor to feel that order still existed. From the outside, Granada could look like a miracle of beauty suspended above a narrowing world. But beneath the beauty was calculation. After the 13th century conquests, Muslim sovereignty in Iberia had been compressed into the south. Córdoba was gone. Valencia was gone. Seville was gone. The old spread of Al-Andalus had shrunk into a mountain kingdom pressed between Castile, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and its own internal rivalries. If Granada wanted to live, it could not pretend to be Córdoba reborn. It had to become something more delicate, a state that knew when to bend. The Nasrid Emirate took shape in the 1230s under Muhammad I ibn Nasr, often known as Ibn al-Hamar. His achievement was not conquest on the scale of the old caliphs. It was survival after catastrophe. In 1246, through the Treaty of Jaén, he entered a vassal relationship with Ferdinand III of Castile, surrendering Jaén and agreeing to pay tribute. He even provided assistance to Ferdinand during the campaign against Seville in 1248. For later memory, that can look humiliating. For a ruler surrounded by stronger enemies, it was a way to keep a kingdom alive. Tribute was the price of time. It allowed Granada to remain Muslim-ruled while accepting Castile's superior position. It gave Castilian kings money and prestige. It gave the Nasrids breathing room behind the Sierra Nevada and the fortified approaches of the south. Each payment admitted weakness, but refusal could invite invasion before Granada was ready to resist. This was the central contradiction of Nasrid power. Granada survived because it accepted dependence, yet dependence slowly taught its enemies to see Granada as a prize, waiting for the right moment. The geography helped. Granada was not an easy target. Mountains protected it. The Sierra Nevada made movement difficult. Fortresses guarded roads and valleys. The kingdom held important ports and connections through places such as Malaga and Almeria, linking it to Mediterranean trade and North African politics. Silk, ceramics, metalwork, agriculture, and commerce gave it resources beyond its size. Still, geography could only delay danger. It could not abolish it. Imagine a silk weaver in Granada during the 14th century, working in a room where light falls through a narrow opening and dust clings to dyed thread. Outside, water runs through channels that feed gardens and workshops. The city smells of wool, spices, damp plaster, and smoke from cooking fires. His cloth may travel through merchants toward Christian courts, North African buyers, or local elites who want beauty in a time of pressure. Then, a rumor enters the room. Tribute is overdue. A prince has rebelled. Castile is distracted, or perhaps not distracted enough. A Marinid force may cross from North Africa, or it may not come at all. The weaver's hands continue their work because thread does not wait for politics. But the price of dye, the safety of roads, the demand from the court, and the tax collector's mood all depend on decisions made far above him. This is how Granada's survival reached ordinary lives. Not as an abstract diplomatic game, but as instability priced into cloth, grain, rent, and fear. The Nasrid rulers understood theatre as part of rule. The Alhambra was not just a palace of leisure. It was a political instrument. Under rulers such as Yusuf I and Muhammad V in the 14th century, the palace complex reached some of its most celebrated forms. Courtyards, inscriptions, muqarnas, water and controlled movement made authority feel refined and divinely ordered. A court that looked fragile on the map could appear eternal inside its walls. Beauty did political work. It impressed ambassadors. It disciplined courtiers through ceremony. It told subjects that the dynasty remained chosen, cultivated, and capable of commanding artisans, poets, scholars, and engineers. It turned limited resources into symbolic abundance. When a ruler cannot dominate every battlefield, he may try to dominate the imagination of those who enter his court. But the Alhambra could not hide every fracture. Nasrid politics were often unstable. Palace factions, family rivalries, assassinations, depositions, and competing claimants weakened the emirate from within. Granada's rulers had to balance court elites, military forces, urban interests, religious authority, frontier commanders, and foreign alliances. At times, they played Castile against North African powers. At other times, Castile played Nasrid claimants against one another. The kingdom survived because its enemies were distracted. That was a useful strategy, but not one Granada fully controlled. Castile had its own civil wars, succession disputes, noble rebellions, fiscal problems, and conflicts with other Christian powers. During such moments, Granada could maneuver. It could raid the frontier, withhold payment, support one faction, seek allies across the strait, or negotiate from temporary strength. When Castile was united, the space for maneuver narrowed. North Africa remained both hope and uncertainty. The Marinids of Morocco sometimes intervened in Iberian politics, offering the possibility of renewed Muslim military pressure against Castile. But after the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340, where Castilian and Portuguese forces defeated the Marinids and their allies, the prospect of a major North African reversal of Christian expansion weakened. Granada could still look south for diplomacy, trade, and occasional support, but it could no longer rely on a great external shield in the old Almoravid or Almohad style. That left Granada brilliant, useful, and exposed. Its usefulness was part of its protection. Castile did not always benefit from destroying it immediately. A tributary Granada could provide money. A controlled frontier could offer nobles opportunity without requiring full annexation. A surviving Muslim kingdom could be a diplomatic peace, a source of revenue, and a buffer. For long periods, leaving Granada alive was more convenient than absorbing it. Convenience, however, is not mercy. It lasts only while circumstances support it. Inside Granada, the cost of this arrangement accumulated quietly. Tribute placed pressure on taxpayers. Court splendor required extraction. Fortresses needed maintenance. Frontier defense demanded manpower. Trade could enrich the kingdom, but war could interrupt roads and ports. Political survival became a constant act of accounting. How much could be paid? How much could be promised? Which rival could be appeased? Which enemy could be delayed? The Nasrids became masters of postponement. Postponement can look like wisdom for a long time. It can preserve families, cities, languages, rituals, and crafts that would otherwise vanish. It can turn a doomed position into centuries of life. Granada's survival was not fake. More than 200 years is not an accident. The emirate endured because its rulers, officials, soldiers, merchants, farmers, and artisans maintained a delicate system under constant pressure. But postponement has a weakness. It cannot choose the moment when the stronger neighbor stops accepting delay. By the late 15th century, The conditions that had protected Granada began to disappear. Castile and Aragon were not suddenly modern states, but under Ferdinand and Isabella, they could coordinate more effectively than before. The War of the Castilian Succession had ended in 1479. Strengthening Isabella's position, the union of the crowns gave the Catholic monarchs a broader base of resources, diplomacy, and legitimacy, even though their realms remained legally distinct. Granada, meanwhile, suffered from internal dynastic conflict. Abu al-Hasan Ali, his brother Muhammad al-Zagal, and his son Muhammad XII, Boabdil, became entangled in a struggle that weakened the kingdom at the worst possible time. A state built on delay cannot afford civil conflict when its enemies have learned patience. The Alhambra still shone, the water still moved, but the political weather had changed. What had once made Granada valuable as a tributary survivor now made it vulnerable as the final unfinished piece of a sacred project. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquest of Granada could unify nobles behind war, strengthen royal authority, satisfy religious ambition, and complete the story that Christian monarchy had told about Iberia for centuries. Granada had spent generations buying time. Now time was becoming the one thing it could no longer purchase. The next chapter begins with that realization hardened into campaign. Cannon dragged through mud, siege camps rising outside mountain towns, royal accountants counting the cost of holiness, and a divided Nasrid house trying to survive a war that would not fade after one season. The final war did not begin with a single trumpet. It began with raids, reprisals, calculations, old resentments, and a frontier that had spent centuries teaching rulers how to turn violence into policy. By the 1480s, Granada was still alive, but its survival had become thinner. Tribute had bought time. Mountains had delayed invasion. Diplomacy had stretched weakness into endurance. Yet every device that had kept the Nasrid Emirate breathing depended on one condition. Castile had to remain distracted enough, divided enough, or patient enough to let Granada continue. Under Ferdinand and Isabella, that condition began to fail. The War of the Castilian Succession had ended in 1479, strengthening Isabella's position in Castile. Ferdinand, already King of Sicily and soon fully positioned within Aragonese power, brought his own diplomatic instincts and Mediterranean experience. Their marriage did not instantly create a modern Spain, but it did create a partnership capable of coordinating resources more effectively than many earlier rulers had managed. Granada faced not a raid, but a monarchy learning how to sustain pressure. The spark came in 1482. Nasrid forces seized Zahara, a Christian-held frontier town, in a move that fit the old rhythm of border warfare. Raids had long shaped the frontier. Towns changed hands, captives were taken. Honor demanded response. But the Christian reaction moved beyond routine retaliation. A Castilian force led by Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, Marquis of Cadiz, captured Alhambra de Granada, a fortress town dangerously close to Granada itself. Alhambra was not the largest prize. It was worse than that. It was a wound near the heart. For Granada, losing Alhambra meant that the enemy had seized a position inside the kingdom's defensive body. It threatened communications, morale, and prestige. Abu al-Hasan Ali, the Nasrid ruler, now faced a crisis that exposed the weakness beneath court splendor. The war had entered a new phase before either side fully understood how long it would last. The Castilian crown did not simply abandon Alhambra after the raid. That decision mattered. Holding a captured fortress required supply, repair, reinforcement, and political will. It transformed a daring strike into a permanent pressure point. A raid can be forgotten. A garrison must be fed. That was how the 10-year war revealed its true nature. It was a war of persistence. Imagine a Castilian muleteer moving through mud with a train of animals carrying grain, bolts, tools, and powder toward a forward position. His world is not the romance of crusade. It is a snapped strap, a lame mule, wet leather, spoiled flour, and the fear that a mountain road may hide archers or raiders. Priests may describe the campaign as sacred. Nobles may speak of honor. The muleteer knows that a hungry garrison will not hold because a sermon called it holy. War becomes real in the supply line. Ferdinand and Isabella understood this better than many rulers who preferred glory to arithmetic. The Granada campaign required money from towns, contributions from the church, crusading revenues, noble service, artillery specialists, engineers, laborers, animals, roads, and seasonal planning. Each fortress taken had to be held. Each siege had to be financed. Each army had to return or remain without dissolving into unpaid frustration. The monarchy used holy language, but it also used paperwork. That combination made it dangerous. Earlier frontier wars could flare and fade. The Catholic monarchs increasingly turned the war into an organized royal project. Councils, treasurers, commanders, and local authorities were drawn into the machinery of campaign after campaign. The war gave the crown a reason to demand cooperation from nobles and towns. It also gave nobles a theater in which ambition could be rewarded without turning immediately against the monarchy. Granada, meanwhile, was divided at the worst possible moment. Abu al-Hasan Ali faced internal opposition. His son, Mohammed XII, known as Boabdil, challenged for power. Abu al-Hasan's brother, Mohammed al-Zagal, also became a major figure in the struggle. The Nasrid house had survived faction before, but civil conflict during a sustained external campaign was far more dangerous than intrigue during a pause. Every rival claim offered Castile a chance to negotiate with one prince against another. A kingdom under siege cannot afford to split its own shadow. In 1483, Boabdil was captured after the Battle of Lucena. The event could have ended him. Instead, it made him useful. Ferdinand and Isabella released him under conditions that turned a defeated claimant into a political instrument. Boabdil could return to Granada with Christian backing or tolerance, deepening the internal fracture and weakening unified resistance. This was not mercy. It was strategy wearing a courteous face. The Christian monarchs did not need every Nasrid faction destroyed at once. They needed Granada unable to present one coherent will. A divided enemy allows diplomacy to do what siege engines cannot. It opens gates before walls break. It turns family rivalry into military advantage. As the war continued, the campaign became harsher. Malaga fell in 1487 after a bitter siege. Its fall sent a message far beyond the coast. The city had resisted fiercely, and the consequences were severe. Enslavement, punishment, and the loss of a major port. Malaga's fate taught other towns what refusal could cost. In medieval warfare, terror was not always an accident. It could become instruction. The road to Granada narrowed through examples. For towns still deciding whether to resist, the message was brutal but clear. Surrender might preserve life and property. Resistance could end in catastrophe. The monarchy could use both promise and punishment, mercy and fear, terms and devastation. This was not contradiction. It was siege politics. Inside Muslim communities, the psychological pressure must have been relentless. Imagine a woman in a Granadan household measuring grain during the later years of the war. The room is cool but tense. A child sleeps badly. Outside, news comes from another town. One fortress has fallen, another has negotiated, a road is unsafe, a relative may be captive, a tax demand has risen. The smell of bread is thinner than it used to be. She does not know whether the court will stand, whether Boabdil will bargain, whether Al-Zagal will fight, whether the Christians will honor terms if they enter. The war reaches her as uncertainty before it reaches her as conquest. By 1489, Baza surrendered after a prolonged campaign. Its fall was a decisive blow because it opened the eastern side of the kingdom and helped unravel remaining Nasrid positions. Guadix and Almeria followed into Christian hands. Muhammad al-Zagal, who had resisted more strongly than Boabdil in some phases, eventually lost his position. One by one, the outer defenses of Granada ceased to be shields and became memories. Ferdinand and Isabella did not win by one method alone. They used artillery against fortifications. They used negotiation when negotiation saved cost. They used noble rivalries and Nasrid divisions. They used religious legitimacy to keep the campaign morally charged. They used administrative pressure to keep resources moving. The war was medieval in its symbols and increasingly disciplined in its organization. That is why it became a turning point in royal power. The Granada War helped the monarchy practice coordination across territories, estates, towns, church revenues, and aristocratic service. It did not create absolute monarchy overnight, but it strengthened habits of command. It taught the crown how to demand sacrifice for a project that could be presented as both national and sacred, even though Spain remained legally and institutionally plural. The camp of Santa Fe made that permanence visible. Built near Granada in 1491, Santa Fe was more than a military camp. Its very name, Holy Faith, turned geography into declaration. It told Granada that the besiegers were not simply passing through for another campaign season. They were prepared to remain until the last negotiation. A camp that becomes a town is a threat in stone and timber. By then, Granada's options had collapsed into bargaining. The capitulations of Granada, negotiated in late 1491, offered terms that promised protection for Muslim religion, property, law, and customs. These terms allowed surrender without the destruction of the city. For Boabdil, they offered a way to avoid massacre and preserve something for his people, even as sovereignty disappeared. For Ferdinand and Isabella, they delivered the final prize without the unpredictable cost of storming one of the most symbolic cities in Iberia. On January 2nd, 1492, the war ended in ceremony. But the 10-year war had already done its deeper work. It had turned Granada from a tributary survivor into a conquered possession. It had shown the Catholic monarchs that sacred warfare could strengthen royal authority. It had taught towns, nobles, clergy, and soldiers to participate in a shared project under the crown's direction. It had transformed Nasrid division into Castilian advantage. It had used both artillery and treaty, both fear and promise, and it left behind a dangerous question. If the final Muslim kingdom had surrendered under terms of protection, would victory respect those terms once fear of the enemy faded? Or would the logic that had sustained the war demand a more complete transformation of the people who remained? The keys had changed hands. The harder conquest was about to begin. The war ended before the question did. On January 2nd, 1492, Granada surrendered. The keys changed hands. The banners rose. The last independent Muslim kingdom in Iberia disappeared into the authority of Ferdinand and Isabella. Chroniclers could make the scene look complete. A Christian monarchy receiving the final city. A defeated emir leaving the Alhambra. A long struggle closing in ceremony. But ceremonies are designed to hide unfinished things. The capitulations of Granada had promised protection to the city's Muslim population. Religion, property, customs, and law were to be respected under Christian rule. These terms were not decorative. They were the reason surrender could happen without a final catastrophe inside the city. A negotiated ending allowed the Catholic monarchs to take Granada intact, and it allowed Granada's people to imagine that defeat did not have to mean erasure. For a brief moment, that imagination still had room to breathe. The first problem was simple and dangerous. Victory had created a monarchy with a story too powerful to remain modest. Ferdinand and Isabella had not only conquered a kingdom, they had completed a sacred narrative generations in the making. The Reconquista could now be remembered as a providential arc from lost restoration. From 711 to 1492, from the broken Visigothic world to the Catholic monarchs standing in Granada. That story gave meaning. It also demanded purity. If the war had been fought as a recovery of Christian Iberia, then the people who did not fit that recovery became harder to explain. Muslims who remained in Granada were no longer simply frontier enemies or tributary subjects of a surviving emirate. They were now internal subjects of a victorious Christian monarchy. Jews who had lived for centuries across Muslim and Christian Iberia as scholars, physicians, merchants, translators, financiers, craftsmen, taxpayers, and neighbors also stood inside a realm increasingly anxious about religious unity. The enemy outside the walls had been defeated. Suspicion moved inward. In March 1492, only months after Granada's surrender, the Alhambra decree ordered Jews in Castile and Aragon to convert or leave. The timing matters. It does not mean the fall of Granada alone caused the expulsion. Anti-Jewish violence, conversion anxiety, church pressure, social resentment, and royal policy had deeper roots. But the victory at Granada strengthened the monarchy's confidence and sharpened the atmosphere in which religious difference could be treated as a political problem. Imagine a Jewish family preparing to leave a town in Castile or Aragon that summer. On a table lie documents, a few coins, household keys, perhaps a prayer book wrapped in cloth, perhaps a contract that will mean little once the road begins. The room smells of dust, wool, wax, and fear kept quiet for the children. A house is not an idea. It is a threshold worn by years of feet. A wall marked by smoke, a neighbor's voice through the courtyard. A decree can turn all of that into luggage. Some converted, some left. Some tried to sell what could not be carried and discovered that desperation lowers the price of a lifetime. The monarchy did not see itself as destroying a world. It saw itself as securing one. That is often how coercion speaks, in the language of order. Granada's Muslims initially occupied a different legal position because the surrender terms protected them. Hernando de Talavera, the first Archbishop of Granada after the conquest, pursued a more gradual approach to conversion. But patience did not satisfy every voice at court or in the church. By the end of the 1490s, Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros pushed a harsher policy. Pressure increased, books were seized, conversions were demanded more aggressively. Resistance and revolt followed in Granada and the Alpujarras. The treaty world began to crack. In 1502, Muslims in Castile were ordered to convert or leave. In practice, leaving was often difficult, constrained, or unrealistic. Many became Christians in law while remaining suspect in society. Moriscos, converted Muslims whose sincerity would be watched, questioned, and policed for generations. The old frontier had moved into kitchens, festivals, clothing, language, bathing customs, food habits, and memory. This was the harder conquest. Taking Granada required armies, artillery, mule trains, siege camps, money, and negotiation. Transforming the people who remained required priests, officials, courts, informants, edicts, fear, and a state willing to treat private life as evidence. The battlefield had ended, but the logic of sacred victory had not. It had changed instruments. That is the dark legacy of the Reconquista. It built more than borders. It helped build habits of power. The belief that political unity required religious unity, that difference inside the realm was a danger, that conquest could be made holy, that memory could be organized into a weapon for the future. Those habits did not explain everything that Spain would become, but they mattered. They traveled. In 1492, the same monarchs who entered Granada also sponsored Christopher Columbus's westward voyage. The connection should not be flattened into a single cause. The Atlantic world was shaped by navigation, commerce, rivalry, technology, ambition, and accident. Yet the timing is impossible to ignore. A monarchy strengthened by frontier war, religious confidence, and the language of conquest now looked beyond Iberia. The map widened. Methods learned at home could find new uses abroad. Claims of sacred mission, legal arguments for dominion, settlement, forced conversion, extraction, negotiated submission followed by narrowing terms. The Americas were not simply another Granada, but the Iberian experience of war, conversion, frontier rule, and religious identity helped shape how Spanish expansion imagined itself. The Reconquista, therefore, cannot be treated only as an ending in 1492. It was also a beginning. For Christian Spain, it became a foundational myth of triumph and unity. For Muslims and Jews, it became memory of loss, exile, conversion, surveillance, and broken promises. For later Europe, it became part of the story of crusade, state formation, maritime expansion, and the dangerous marriage between faith and royal power. For historians, it remains a warning against stories that make centuries of messy coexistence, rivalry, alliance, violence, and negotiation look like one straight road to destiny. Because the real past was never that clean. Muslim Spain had been conqueror and homeland, court and battlefield, brilliance and hierarchy. Christian Spain had been survivor and aggressor, tributary and conqueror, divided kingdom and sacred monarchy. The people between those labels, farmers, translators, captives, converts, merchants, potters, soldiers, widows, scribes, lived the cost of each political simplification. Return, then, to the keys. The keys of Granada made history look touchable. A city passed from one hand to another, and the world seemed to understand what had happened. But the more important transfer was less visible. A long frontier war had handed the new monarchy a language of unity through exclusion, victory through purification, and rule through the management of belief. That language would outlive the battlefield. Can a war last longer than entire civilizations? Not as continuous fighting. Not as one unbroken campaign. not as a simple line from Pelayo to Boabdil. But a war can last for centuries when it becomes an institution, an economy, a memory, and finally a story a society tells about itself. The Reconquista lasted because it was never only war. It was land, it was tax, it was faith, it was fear, it was opportunity. It was the slow conversion of frontier violence into political identity. And when Granada fell, that identity did not lay down its weapons. It looked for new enemies. The Alhambra still stands above Granada. Water still moves through its channels. Visitors still read fragments of a world that defeat did not fully erase. Somewhere in the imagination, the keys still rest on cloth, small enough to hold, too heavy to understand at a glance. If this story leaves us with anything, it is not the comfort of victory. It is the warning that a society shaped by centuries of sacred conflict may find peace more difficult than war. And if you want the next chapter in this series, tell us which kingdom, dynasty, or empire should face the judgment of history next, because history is not a list of dates. It is the autopsy of power, written in cities, borders, laws, and the lives of people who rarely get to choose the stories rulers tell about them.